Dakota Territory, Bitter Creek, winter, 1881-1882. The gunshot shattered the February morning quiet like glass against stone, the bullet whining past Giselle Renard's ear so close she felt its heat scorch her skin. Deputy Luke Murdoch's voice had been shouting threats just seconds before, and now came the metallic click of his Colt single-action Army 1873 revolver being cocked again. She pressed deeper into the shadows between Kellerman's general store and the blacksmith's shed, her scarred right hand trembling as she clutched the deerskin pouch against her chest. The intricate quillwork patterns, red, blue, yellow, and white geometric designs, seemed to pulse in the pale winter light filtering through the Dakota Territory dawn. At 24, she'd learned to recognize the difference between bluster and killing intent. The way Murdoch's pale gray eyes had gone flat and predatory told her this silence was death stalking closer. "French witch has got to be somewhere close," came his voice again, boots crunching through the crusted snow as he circled the alley like a hunting wolf. "Can't hide forever, darling, not when there's good money waiting for that bundle you stole." Giselle's heart hammered against her ribs. The sacred bundle had belonged to Henri Dubois, a French fur trader who died in her adoptive father's clinic in Minneapolis 2 years ago. With his final breath, he'd pressed it into her hands. "Keep it safe, petite. Belongs to people who know the old ways of healing." The medicinal herbs inside, especially the sacred tobacco, had worked miracles on fever cases here in Bitter Creek, where she'd been practicing as the only healer for miles. A shadow fell across the alley mouth. Deputy Murdoch appeared, his Colt trained directly on her hiding spot, and this time his narrow, weathered face held the certainty of a man who'd convinced himself that murder was simpler than dealing with paperwork. At 32, Luke Murdoch had spent 5 years watching Dr. Pike drink himself into uselessness while people died from treatable ailments. Now, this scarred Frenchwoman arrived and showed him up at every turn, undermining the natural order he understood where men held authority and women stayed in their proper place. "There you are." His voice carried lazy satisfaction tinged with something uglier. "Been looking for you since before dawn. That Indian bundle you've been using for your witchcraft, turns out it's worth considerable money to certain collectors back east. More than my deputy's salary for a whole year." The claim was probably true. Sacred tribal artifacts commanded high prices among wealthy Eastern collectors, who displayed them as exotic curiosities, never understanding their spiritual significance. But Murdoch's real motivation wasn't greed. It was the humiliation of being shown up by a woman, a foreigner, a scarred outsider who did everything better than the men who were supposed to be in charge. "I help sick people," Giselle said, stepping into view with her chin raised, despite the gun pointed at her heart. The fire scars mapping the right side of her face caught the pale light, and she saw Murdoch's expression shift from predatory hunger to open disgust. "You contaminate good Christian folk with heathen magic," Murdoch spat, his gun hand steady as granite. "Making the rest of us look like fools with your foreign ways. Time someone reminded this territory what happens to women who forget their place." The single word that cut through the morning air carried enough quiet authority to freeze Murdoch's finger on the trigger. "Deputy." A man stepped from the shadows at the alley's far end, tall, moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator. His buckskin vest was decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the light like captured stars, and a single eagle feather hung from hair black as midnight. But it was his dark, measuring eyes that held Murdoch's attention and made the deputy's gun hand waver with sudden uncertainty. Chaska had been tracking this confrontation since it began, following the sounds of shouting and gunfire that had awakened him in the pre-dawn darkness. At 28, he'd spent years moving between Lakota camps and white settlements, learning to read the signs when men with badges decided to make examples of people who couldn't fight back. This morning, warrior's instinct had drawn him toward the scent of violence brewing in Bitter Creek's frozen streets. "This is official business," Murdoch said, trying to recover his authority, but unable to keep the tremor from his voice. Something about the way the Lakota warrior stood perfectly balanced, hands loose at his sides, suggested coiled violence ready to spring. "What kind of business?" Chaska's tone was conversational, but his dark eyes never left Murdoch's gun hand. "Confiscation of stolen federal artifacts. Got word from territorial headquarters about missing tribal goods being sold by unscrupulous healers." The lie came smoothly practiced from weeks of planning. Chaska's gaze shifted to the pouch in Giselle's hands, and recognition flickered across his angular features. The quill work wasn't just decorative, it was as distinctive as a signature to anyone raised in Lakota tradition. This wasn't stolen, held in custody by the Office of Indian Affairs, or Army stores as evidence or ethnographic property. It was a sacred bundle taken from his people during the cavalry raids of the 1860s, when soldiers had swept through camps collecting specimens for Eastern museums and private collectors. "Show me the warrant," Chaska said quietly. "Don't need papers for stolen goods in plain sight." Murdoch's confidence was returning now that he remembered he held the gun and represented territorial law. "Then you won't mind waiting for federal marshals to handle federal cases." Chaska's hand rested casually near the knife at his belt, the movement so subtle it was almost invisible. "Unless you got some personal interest in this particular bundle." The challenge was clear, and Murdoch understood that drawing on a Lakota warrior in broad daylight would bring consequences even corrupt deputies couldn't escape. Not with half the town beginning to wake up and emerge from their buildings to investigate the gunshot that had shattered the morning quiet. "This ain't finished," Murdoch said finally, holstering his weapon with obvious reluctance. "Federal authorities are coming to Dakota territory real soon. When they get here, we'll see who's really breaking the law and who's been helping them do it." As the deputy's footsteps faded into Bitter Creek's muddy main street, Giselle found herself alone with the man who'd just saved her life. Chaska studied her scarred face without flinching or looking away, the first person in months to meet her eyes directly without pity or revulsion. "Thank you," she said quietly, her French accent still coloring the English words despite years of practice. "I don't know why he wanted this so badly." She held up the bundle with reverent care, her fingers tracing the intricate quill work patterns. Chaska was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with conflicting loyalties that had torn at him for years. The bundle should be returned to his people immediately. It was sacred, it was stolen, and it belonged with those who understood its true spiritual significance. But watching how gently she handled it, seeing the genuine reverence in her touch, suggested this wasn't simple theft or cultural desecration. "Where did you get it?" he asked finally. "From Henri Dubois, a fur trader who died in my adoptive father's clinic in Minneapolis." With his last breath, he pressed it into my hands and said it belonged to people who understood the old ways of healing. Her voice carried the weight of a promise made to a dying man. "The medicine's inside. They've saved lives that nothing else could touch." The explanation clarified some things while complicating others. Dubois had probably acquired the bundle during federal raids or through trading with desperate tribal members forced to sell sacred objects for survival. But his deathbed gift suggested guilt about its origins, and now the sacred objects were being used for healing again, closer to their original purpose than most stolen artifacts ever achieved. "My name is Giselle Renard." She extended her unscarred left hand with careful formality. "Chaska." He took her hand briefly, noting calluses from hard frontier work and the steady grip of someone accustomed to precise, delicate movements. Before either could say more, urgent shouts erupted from the direction of Main Street. Dr. Pike's voice rose above others, calling for help with a medical emergency. A child had been kicked by Henderson's stallion and was bleeding heavily in the frozen mud outside the livery stable. Giselle moved toward the crisis without hesitation, her medical training overriding concerns about deputies' federal investigations or her own safety. Chaska followed, curious to see how she handled herself under pressure and wondering if her healing skills matched her obvious courage. The injured boy was Tommy Chen, 8-year-old son of one of the Chinese miners who'd come to work the played-out gold claims north of town. His black hair was matted with blood from a deep gash above his left ear, and his dark eyes weren't focusing properly, clear signs of serious head trauma that could prove fatal without immediate skilled treatment. Dr. Pike was fumbling with his medical bag, hands shaking from too much whiskey and too little sleep. At 55, Alton Pike had been practicing medicine for over 20 years, but his skills had deteriorated along with his character and his sobriety. His lean frame was stooped with premature age, and his pale gray eyes, so similar to Giselle's own, though neither had noticed the resemblance, yet held the watery uncertainty of a man who'd lost confidence in his abilities. "Need to get him to the clinic," Pike muttered, pressing a questionably clean cloth against the scalp wound with trembling fingers. "Proper facilities for this kind of injury. Can't do surgery in the street." "No time," Giselle said crisply, kneeling in the frozen mud without regard for her wool dress or her dignity. She opened her leather medical satchel and began pulling out supplies with practiced efficiency, clean cloth glass bottles of tinctures, surgical instruments that gleamed with professional maintenance. "The bleeding has to be controlled now, or there won't be time for anything else." Her hands moved with the confident precision of someone who'd performed such procedures many times before. She cleaned the wound with carbolic acid, her touch gentle despite the urgency, and examined the damage with the thoroughness of a trained physician. The gash was deep, but hadn't penetrated the skull. More dangerous was the swelling that could build pressure inside the boy's head if not monitored and treated properly. "Tommy," she said softly, holding up 2 fingers in front of his unfocused gaze. "How many fingers do you see?" The boy blinked slowly, his pupils visibly different sizes, a dangerous sign. "4, no 2. Everything's spinning, miss." "That's all right. Just hold very still for me." Her voice carried calm confidence as she began stitching with silk thread, each suture placed with surgical precision that spoke of formal training rather than frontier improvisation. Chaska watched with growing respect and something deeper admiration for her skill, her courage, and the gentle way she spoke to the frightened child. Her movements were as precise as any frontier doctor he'd encountered, her technique learned from someone with genuine medical education. More importantly, she had the calm presence that kept patients relaxed during painful procedures, a gift that couldn't be taught in any medical school. "You've done this before," he observed quietly, noting how she controlled bleeding with pressure points and managed the boy's pain with practiced efficiency. "My adoptive father was a doctor in Quebec," she replied without looking up from her work, never letting the needle falter in her steady hands. "Dr. Auguste Renard. He taught me everything he could before." She paused, old pain flickering across her features. "Before the fever took him. It wasn't enough training for medical school, but it was enough to help when there's no one else available." As she spoke, Chaska found himself studying her profile, noting the determination in the set of her jaw and the gentleness in her scarred hands as she worked to save a child's life. There was something about her that drew him, not just her medical skills or her courage, but a quality of stubborn compassion that reminded him of the best healers among his own people. The crowd that had gathered began dispersing as the immediate crisis was handled with obvious competence. "Doctor." Pike stood aside, his face flushed with embarrassment at being shown up by an unlicensed woman who was clearly more skilled than he was, more sober and more dedicated to actual healing than profit. "This is highly irregular," Pike said stiffly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Medical treatment should be conducted in proper facilities by licensed physicians with appropriate credentials." Medical treatment should be conducted wherever it's needed most, Giselle replied, tying off the last suture with expert care. Tommy needs rest for the next few days. Someone should wake him every 2 hours to check his responses. If he starts vomiting, becomes confused, or his pupils change size, bring him to me immediately. Tommy's father pressed silver coins into Giselle's palm despite her protests. Thank you, miss. Thank you very much. You saved my boy's life today. As Li Chen carefully carried his son toward their small cabin near the creek, Dr. Pike approached Giselle with obvious reluctance and something that might have been grudging respect. I suppose I should thank you, he said quietly. The boy might have died if we'd tried moving him to the clinic in that condition. Your suturing technique is quite professional. You're welcome, Giselle replied simply, cleaning blood from her instruments with methodical care that spoke of ingrained habit. Pike watched her work, noting the quality of her surgical tools and their professional maintenance. Everything about her technique spoke of formal medical training, not just frontier practicality learned through necessity. The way she held her instruments, the precision of her sutures, even her diagnostic methods, all suggested education from someone with genuine skill and knowledge. Where exactly did you study medicine? He asked, something in his voice, suggesting more than casual curiosity. With my adoptive father in Quebec after the fire took my birth family. Pride and old grief colored her voice. Dr. Renard served with the British Army Medical Corps during the Crimean War. He said medicine was about helping people heal, not making money from their suffering. The pointed comment was delivered without malice, but its implication was clear. Pike flushed at the indirect criticism, but something else in her words made him study her scarred features more intently. There was something familiar about the shape of her nose, the color of her eyes pale gray, like his own unusual coloring that stood out sharply against her dark hair. Combined with her mention of Quebec and fire and lost family, it stirred memories he'd been trying to forget for over 20 years. Before he could pursue the troubling thought, Deputy Murdoch reappeared this time with 3 other men in tow. He'd spent the morning gathering support for another attempt at confiscation, finding allies among miners who resented competition for Pike's medical attention and prices, and among the more prejudiced townspeople who distrusted foreigners and their unnatural ways. There she is, Murdoch announced to his small crowd of supporters, his voice carrying the theatrical authority of a man performing for an audience. Practicing medicine without proper license, using stolen government property, probably spreading disease with foreign remedies and heathen magic. Time this town protected itself from outside contamination. The accusation was inflammatory enough to draw attention from everyone within earshot. Several more townspeople stopped to listen, their expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. In frontier communities where suspicion of outsiders ran deep and medical care was scarce, such charges could quickly turn crowds into dangerous mobs. But before the situation could escalate into violence, an unexpected voice cut through the tension with schoolteacher authority that brooked no nonsense. Luke Murdoch, you put that gun away right this instant. Mary Tate pushed through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd been managing unruly children and adults for 15 years across 3 different frontier settlements. At 35, the former Ohio schoolmarm had seen enough frontier justice to recognize the difference between legitimate law enforcement and bullying disguised as official duty. This woman just provided better medical care than we've seen in months. Mary continued clearly, her voice carrying to everyone present with the projection she'd learned from years of classroom teaching. She saved that boy's life with skill that our own doctor couldn't match. If you want to arrest someone for competent medical practice, Deputy Murdoch, you'll have to go through me first. Other voices began joining in support, Li Chen describing in broken but fervent English how Giselle had saved his son's life. Mrs. Patterson mentioning fever remedies that had helped her through pneumonia when Pike's treatments had failed, even some of the miners grudgingly admitting that her treatments cost less money and produced better results than the doctor's standard whiskey and laudanum prescriptions. Faced with unexpected community support, Murdoch found his position crumbling faster than he'd anticipated. He'd counted on fear, prejudice, and resentment of outsiders to carry the day, but competent medical work had earned Giselle allies he hadn't expected and couldn't easily dismiss. "Federal authorities are coming to Dakota Territory," the deputy said, finally backing away from the increasingly hostile crowd, but maintaining his threatening tone. "When they arrive next week, we'll see who's really breaking territorial law and who's been helping them do it. Mark my words, this ain't over." As Murdoch and his supporters retreated down Main Street, muttering among themselves about foreign witches and government property, Giselle found herself surrounded by grateful townspeople, offering thanks and requesting treatment for various ailments. The demonstration of her medical skills had transformed her from suspicious outsider to valued community resource in the space of a single emergency. But Chaska remained at the crowd's edge, his expression thoughtful, as he watched her interact with patients and answer questions about treatments. The sacred bundle represented a debt that would have to be settled eventually, regardless of how many lives she saved with the medicines it contained. His people had been robbed of more than ceremonial objects. They'd been robbed of spiritual authority and cultural continuity that couldn't be replaced with gratitude from white settlers. The question was whether justice required immediate return of stolen sacred items, or whether it could accommodate how they were currently being used for their original purpose of healing. Complex moral problems rarely had simple answers, especially when innocent lives hung in the balance of whatever decision he made. As the crowd gradually dispersed and excitement faded into the routine bustle of afternoon activities, Giselle approached Chaska with uncertainty written across her scarred features. "You could have supported the deputy," she said quietly. "Told him to take the bundle and arrest me for theft. It would have been easier for you, safer. Why didn't you?" Chaska considered his words carefully, understanding that his answer would shape whatever relationship developed between them. "Because watching you work with that child, that wasn't theft or desecration. That was healing the same purpose the bundle served among my people. Maybe the spirits guided it to someone who would use it properly, even if she doesn't yet understand its full significance." "What happens now?" she asked, clutching the bundle protectively against her chest. "Now we figure out how to honor both your patients' needs and my people's rights to their sacred objects. There might be a way to serve both if we're willing to trust each other and work together." Neither could have predicted how quickly events would force them to test that fragile cooperation. Even as they spoke, riders were approaching Bitter Creek from the East Federal agents, whose arrival would shatter any hope of peaceful resolution and thrust all of them into dangers none had anticipated. That evening, as winter darkness settled over the territory like a heavy blanket, Giselle found herself sharing supper with Chaska in the small cabin behind Pike's clinic that served as her living quarters. The doctor had retreated to his usual evening bout with whiskey, leaving them alone to discuss the sacred bundle and what should be done with it. "Tell me about your people's medicine," Giselle said, as she prepared tea from herbs in her own collection. "I know the plants in this bundle are powerful, but I don't understand their spiritual significance." Chaska watched her careful movements as she measured and mixed, noting the reverence with which she handled each ingredient. "Among the Lakota, healing is not just about treating the body," he explained. "It's about restoring balance between the person, their community, and the spirit world. The bundle contains not just medicines but prayers and blessings accumulated over generations." "I can feel that," Giselle said softly, sitting across from him at the small wooden table. "When I use the sacred tobacco for high fevers, it's like the plants themselves want to heal, as if they carry the intentions of everyone who blessed them." Her understanding surprised him. Most white people he'd encountered viewed native medicine as primitive superstition, unable to see past their own cultural assumptions to recognize genuine spiritual wisdom. But Giselle seemed to grasp intuitively what many never learned, that healing involved more than just physical treatment. "Your adopted father must have been an unusual man," Chaska observed, "to teach you to see medicine that way." Pain flickered across Giselle's features. "Papa Auguste saved my life in more ways than one. After the fire that killed my birth family and left me scarred, he could have sent me to an institution or found someone else to take a damaged child. Instead, he adopted me as his own daughter and taught me that scars don't define a person's worth." She traced unconsciously at the burn marks on her face, a gesture Chaska recognized as long habit. "He showed me that healing, whether of bodies or hearts, was the most important work anyone could do. That it didn't matter what people looked like or where they came from, only whether they were willing to help when help was needed." "What happened to him?" "Fever 3 years ago. The same typhus epidemic that brought Henri Dubois to our clinic." Her voice grew quiet with old grief. "Papa Auguste caught it while treating patients who couldn't afford to pay for medical care. He died as he lived, helping others, even when it cost him everything." Chaska reached across the table to touch her scarred hand gently. "He would be proud of what you're doing here, using the bundle to heal people, honoring its purpose, even without understanding all its traditions." The simple contact sent warmth through Giselle that had nothing to do with the hot tea and everything to do with the kindness in his dark eyes. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like hiding her scars or apologizing for her appearance. "What about you?" she asked. "What brought you to Bitter Creek? It can't be an easy place for a Lakota man to live." Chaska's expression grew somber. "I've been tracking artifacts stolen from my people's sacred bundles, ceremonial pipes, healing objects taken during cavalry raids and sold to Eastern collectors. This bundle was one of many that disappeared when soldiers attacked our winter camps 5 years ago." "So you came here to reclaim it?" "I came here to understand how it was being used and whether the person who had it deserved to keep it." He met her eyes directly. "After watching you today, I believe you do. But that creates problems with my own people who have trusted me to bring sacred objects home." The dilemma was complex and painful for both of them. Giselle had grown to depend on the bundle's medicines for treating the most serious cases, but she understood Chaska's obligation to his community. There had to be a solution that honored both needs, but finding it would require trust and creativity from everyone involved. "Could I learn?" she asked suddenly. "Could you teach me the proper ways to use the bundle, the prayers and ceremonies that go with the medicines? If I understood its spiritual significance, maybe that would make a difference to your people." The suggestion showed wisdom beyond her years and experience. Most white people demanded accommodation to their own cultural practices, but Giselle was offering to adapt herself to Lakota traditions, a form of respect that was both rare and meaningful. "It would take time," Chaska said slowly. "Months, maybe years to learn properly. And there would be opposition from both sides, your people who distrust Indian ways and mine who distrust whites with sacred knowledge." "I have time," Giselle replied with quiet determination. "And I've already faced opposition for my healing methods. If learning your traditions makes me a better healer and helps your people trust me with their sacred objects, then that's what I want to do." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent pounding on the cabin door. Chaska's hand moved instinctively to his knife as he rose to answer, but the voice that called out was Dr. Pike's, thick with whiskey and fear. "Miss Renard, you need to come quickly. Something's happened to the Morrison boy, and his father is threatening to burn down the clinic if you don't save him." Giselle was already reaching for her medical bag before Pike finished speaking. The Morrison family owned the largest ranch in the area, and Patriarch James Morrison had a reputation for violence against anyone who crossed him. If his son was seriously injured or ill, the situation could turn deadly very quickly. "What kind of injury?" she called through the door while gathering supplies. "Snakebite," Pike replied. "Rattlesnake got him while he was checking cattle near the river. The boy's burning with fever and convulsing. I've tried everything I know, but nothing's helping." Rattlesnake bites were often fatal, especially when they occurred far from proper medical treatment. The venom attacked the nervous system, causing paralysis, convulsions, and eventually death, if not treated promptly with the right remedies. Pike's conventional treatments, whiskey, laudanum, and prayer, would be useless against such a specific toxin. But the sacred bundle contained medicines specifically prepared for treating venomous bites. The prairie tribes had been dealing with rattlesnakes for centuries and had developed antidotes that were far more effective than anything in a typical frontier doctor's arsenal. "I need the sacred tobacco and the root medicines," Giselle said to Chaska as she prepared her supplies. "If we're going to save the boy's life, we'll need the strongest remedies in the bundle." Chaska nodded and carefully opened the deerskin pouch, removing specific herbs and powders while speaking quiet prayers in Lakota. This was exactly the kind of situation the bundle had been prepared for, a life-threatening emergency, where traditional native medicines could succeed, where white medicine failed. They hurried through Bitter Creek's dark streets toward the Morrison Ranch, where lanterns blazed in every window, and the sounds of shouting and weeping could be heard from a quarter-mile away. As they approached the main house, James Morrison himself appeared on the front porch, a Winchester .73 model 1873 rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. Morrison was a man in his late 40s who'd built his ranch through a combination of hard work, ruthless dealing, and strategic violence against anyone who opposed him. He stood over 6 feet tall with graying hair and the kind of cold blue eyes that had stared down claim jumpers, cattle thieves, and at least 3 men he'd killed in self-defense over the years. "You the French witch everyone's been talking about?" Morrison demanded, his rifle not quite pointed at them but ready to swing up in an instant. "I'm Dr. Giselle Renard," she replied calmly, despite the weapon and the obvious hostility. "I understand your son has been bitten by a rattlesnake. I have medicines that might help him." "Pike says the boy's dying. Says his conventional treatments aren't working and you might be his only chance." Morrison's voice carried the desperate edge of a man facing the loss of his only child. "I don't hold with foreign witchcraft, but if you can save my boy, I'll make it worth your while. If you can't—" He let the threat hang unfinished. "Let me examine him," Giselle said simply. "Then we'll know what we're dealing with." Inside the ranch house, 12-year-old Billy Morrison lay on his parents' bed, his small body racked with convulsions and burning with fever. The snake bite on his leg had swollen grotesquely, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Mrs. Morrison knelt beside the bed, weeping and praying alternately, while Dr. Pike stood helplessly nearby with his useless medical bag. Giselle examined the boy quickly, but thoroughly, noting the progression of symptoms and the time elapsed since the bite. He was deep into the second stage of rattlesnake poisoning, with venoms that brought swelling fits and breath-stopping stupor attacking his nervous system and threatening to shut down vital functions. Without immediate treatment with specific antidotes, he would be dead before dawn. "We need to prepare the anti-venom remedy," she said quietly to Chaska, who had remained near the door where he could watch for trouble. "The sacred tobacco first to purify his system, then the root mixture to counteract the poison." As they worked together to prepare traditional Lakota snakebite remedies, Giselle found herself grateful for Chaska's presence and knowledge. The bundle contained the right medicines, but she needed his understanding of proper doses and preparation methods to use them safely and effectively. The treatment took most of the night. They administered carefully measured doses of native antidotes, monitored Billy's vital signs, and adjusted the treatment as his body began responding to medicines his father would have dismissed as savage superstition under any other circumstances. By dawn, the crisis had passed. Billy's fever broke. His convulsions stopped and his breathing returned to normal. The swelling in his leg began to subside, and he opened his eyes to ask for water in a voice that was weak but clearly alive. James Morrison stood in the doorway, watching his son drink from a cup. His mother held tears streaming down his weathered face. When he finally looked at Giselle and Chaska, his expression had changed completely from hostility to something approaching awe. "You saved his life," Morrison said simply. "Pike told me the boy was dying, that nothing he knew could help. But your medicines, whatever they are, wherever they came from, they brought him back from death's door." The medicines came from wisdom accumulated over generations by people who understood how to treat such injuries, Giselle replied diplomatically. "I was fortunate to have access to them, and to someone who could teach me their proper use." Morrison's gaze shifted to Chaska, and for a moment the old prejudices warred with gratitude in his eyes. But love for his son won out over racial hatred, at least for now. "I owe you both a debt I can never repay," Morrison said finally. "If there's anything you ever need, anything at all, you come to me. And if anyone in this territory gives you trouble for helping people, they'll answer to me personally." The promise was valuable beyond measure, in a place where Morrison's word carried enormous weight and his displeasure could be literally fatal. But more important was the precedent. It set a prominent white rancher publicly acknowledging the value of native medicine and the competence of a female healer. As they prepared to leave the Morrison ranch, Chaska found himself walking beside Giselle through the early morning mist, both of them exhausted but satisfied with the night's work. "That was well done," he said quietly. "You used the bundle's medicines with respect and skill. My people would approve of what you accomplished tonight." "I couldn't have done it without your guidance," Giselle replied. "The bundle contains incredible knowledge, but I need to understand its proper use. Will you teach me? Not just the medicines, but the prayers and ceremonies that go with them." Chaska considered the request carefully. Teaching sacred knowledge to an outsider was controversial, even dangerous if other tribal members objected. But Giselle had proven herself worthy of trust, and the bundle seemed to respond to her touch as if recognizing a true healer. "I will teach you," he decided, "but it must be done properly with respect for traditions and approval from tribal elders. There are rituals to follow, ceremonies to complete. Are you willing to commit to that?" "Yes," Giselle said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes to become worthy of the trust your people placed in these medicines." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed from the direction of town. In the morning stillness, they could hear voices shouting orders and the metallic rattle of weapons being readied for use. "Federal agents," Chaska said grimly, his warrior instincts immediately alert to danger. Morrison mentioned word had been sent to territorial headquarters about stolen tribal artifacts. "They've come for the bundle." As they reached the outskirts of Bitter Creek, they could see a column of mounted men surrounding Dr. Pike's clinic. At their head rode a man in his 40s, whose bearing and equipment marked him as military, despite wearing civilian clothes. Behind him came Deputy Murdoch and two men in Eastern suits, who could only be government Indian agents. "That's Captain William Morrison," Chaska said quietly, recognition making his voice hard with old anger. "James Morrison's older brother. He commands a unit of irregular cavalry that officially doesn't exist, mercenaries paid to handle problems the regular army can't address through legal channels." The captain was a man who'd learned warfare during the Civil War and applied those brutal lessons to frontier conflicts with systematic efficiency. His unofficial mission was elimination of native leaders who opposed government policies using methods that provided official deniability for his employers in Washington. The death of his nephew from rattlesnake bite would have been convenient excuse to eliminate troublesome Indians and their sympathizers. But Billy Morrison's survival complicated those plans. The captain couldn't very well arrest the people who'd saved his nephew's life without looking like a monster, even by frontier standards. That would make him more dangerous, not less a man whose official mission had been undermined by inconvenient acts of mercy. "Miss Renard," Captain Morrison called out as they approached the clinic. "I need to speak with you about certain items in your possession, items that belong to the federal government and need to be returned to proper custody." The demand was phrased politely, but the 20 armed men surrounding the building made it clear this wasn't a request. Morrison had come prepared for resistance and wouldn't be deterred by legal niceties or community support. "What items would those be?" Captain Giselle asked calmly, though her heart was racing with fear and anger. "Sacred tribal artifacts reported stolen from government custody during recent conflicts. Specifically, a Lakota medicine bundle that's been traced to this settlement through reliable sources." Morrison's voice was professionally neutral, but his eyes held the flat certainty of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "The bundle is here," Chaska said, stepping forward with the deerskin pouch visible in his hands. "But it wasn't stolen from federal custody. It was given to someone who's been using it for its intended purpose, healing the sick and injured." "That's not how federal law interprets possession of tribal ceremonial objects," replied Agent Samuel Cross, one of the Eastern-suited men who'd accompanied Morrison. "All such items are considered government property unless specific ownership can be documented through official channels." The legal position was technically correct, but morally outrageous, designed to strip Native peoples of cultural authority by defining their most sacred possessions as held in custody by the Office of Indian Affairs or Army stores as evidence or ethnographic property. It was law that served political control rather than justice, and everyone present understood the implications. "Then we have a problem," Chaska said quietly, his hand moving to rest near his knife. "Because that bundle belongs to the Lakota people, not the government that stole it from us during cavalry raids." Tension crackled through the morning air as armed men faced each other over a deerskin pouch that represented far more than its material value. This was a confrontation between different concepts of law, justice, and legitimate authority, the kind that often ended in violence when compromise became impossible. But before anyone could draw weapons, Dr. Pike emerged from his clinic with a telegram in his shaking hands and an expression of profound shock on his weathered face. "Captain Morrison," Pike said, his voice unsteady, with more than his usual morning whiskey. "Before you proceed with confiscation, there's something you need to know about that bundle and the woman who's been using it for medical purposes." Pike held up the telegram with hands that trembled from emotional upheaval rather than alcohol withdrawal. "This is from Sister Marie Claire at the Convent of Sacred Heart in Quebec City. She's been investigating survivors of the Saint Laurent district fire in 1861, and she's uncovered information that changes everything we thought we knew about this situation." Giselle felt ice form in her stomach. She'd spent over 20 years trying not to think about the fire that had killed her birth family and left her permanently scarred, trying to build a life not defined by loss and trauma. What does a convent fire have to do with held in custody by the Office of Indian Affairs or Army stores as evidence or ethnographic property seizure? Captain Morrison asked impatiently, though something in Pike's manner suggested this wasn't a simple delaying tactic. "Because," Pike said, meeting Giselle's eyes directly for the first time since she'd known him, "I was there. I was in Quebec City in 1861, serving as medical volunteer during the summer fever epidemic. I treated survivors of the Saint Laurent fire, including—" his voice broke with emotion, 20 years in the making, "including my own granddaughter." The revelation hit Giselle like a physical blow, staggering her with its implications. She'd always assumed strangers had rescued her from the burning building and turned her over to church authorities. The idea that difficult alcoholic Pike had been involved in saving her life was almost impossible to accept. "That's impossible," she whispered, though even as she spoke, she was remembering the familiar color of his eyes, the shape of his nose that matched her own. Pike held out the telegram, with Sister Marie Claire's careful handwriting clearly visible. She found baptismal records showing that Giselle Dubois, born in 1849 to Dr. Jean-Baptiste Dubois and Marie Pike Dubois, was treated for severe burns by Dr. Alton Pike in August 1861. Dr. Pike was listed as the child's maternal grandfather. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that fell over the armed confrontation. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something far more significant than property disputes or jurisdictional arguments. They were watching a family reunion that had been over 20 years in the making. "Marie was my daughter." Pike continued, tears streaming down his face. "She married your father against my wishes. I thought a French Catholic doctor wasn't good enough for my Presbyterian daughter. When the fire took both of them, you were the only family I had left. But I was too proud and too ashamed of my prejudices to admit it." The confession explained so much about their relationship: Pike's hostility toward her methods, his grudging respect for her competence, his recognition of her surgical techniques. He'd been wrestling with unconscious identification of his own granddaughter, raised by someone else, and grown into a woman whose medical skills surpassed his own. "Why didn't you tell me?" Giselle asked, though part of her already understood the answer. "Because I abandoned you," Pike said simply, his voice heavy with guilt and regret. "I left Quebec City in 1862 to serve with Union Army Medical Corps, and I never looked back. Never tried to find out what happened to you, never checked whether you were safe or happy or needed anything from the grandfather who should have protected you." Before anyone could respond to this emotional revelation, Pike continued with information that would transform the legal situation entirely. "But there's more," he said, holding up additional papers from his correspondence with Quebec authorities. "Sister Marie Claire found records showing that the sacred bundle wasn't stolen from federal custody. It was given to my son-in-law, Dr. Jean-Baptiste Dubois, by Lakota healers in 1860, in recognition of medical assistance he provided during a smallpox epidemic." Captain Morrison's expression shifted from professional neutrality to sharp attention. Legal justification for his mission depended on the bundle being stolen, held in custody by the Office of Indian Affairs or Army stores as evidence or ethnographic property. But if it had been legitimately acquired through cultural exchange, his orders no longer applied. "My son-in-law worked for 6 months without payment to treat Lakota families during the epidemic." Pike continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "When it was over, the tribal council gave him this bundle as recognition of his service and permission to use its medicinal knowledge for healing work among all people, not just native communities." Chaska listened with growing amazement as Pike described events that matched tribal oral histories he'd heard from his elders, stories about a white doctor who'd risked his own life to treat native people when no one else would help, earning respect and gratitude that transcended racial boundaries. "After my daughter and son-in-law died in the fire, the bundle was inherited by their daughter, my granddaughter Giselle. She's been using it for exactly the purpose it was intended, healing sick people regardless of their race or ability to pay for treatment." The revelation reframed everything about the bundle's possession and use. This wasn't theft or cultural appropriation. It was inheritance of objects given freely in recognition of medical service that had saved lives. The legal and moral questions that had seemed so complex suddenly became much simpler. "You have documentation for these claims?" Captain Morrison asked, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. His mission had been based on assumptions about theft and illegal possession, but Pike's evidence suggested those assumptions were completely wrong. Pike held up baptismal certificates, marriage records, and what appeared to be testimony from tribal elders written in both English and Lakota. Everything needed to establish legitimate ownership and proper use of ceremonial objects, Captain, including statements from Lakota survivors of the 1860 epidemic who remember Dr. Dubois and the respect he earned from their people. Captain Morrison found himself in an unexpectedly difficult position. Proceeding with seizure despite contradictory evidence would expose him to charges of misconduct and abuse of authority. But retreating without accomplishing his mission would require explanations to superiors who didn't accept failure gracefully. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by an unexpected intervention from the most unlikely source imaginable, James Morrison arriving at full gallop with several of his ranch hands behind him. "William," James called out as he dismounted near the clinic. "What the hell are you doing here, threatening the people who saved my boy's life?" The family resemblance between the Morrison brothers was obvious, but their personalities were completely different. Where Captain Morrison was cold and calculating, James was passionate and direct. Where the captain served distant political masters, James answered only to his own conscience and his family's welfare. "I'm executing federal orders regarding stolen tribal artifacts," Captain Morrison replied stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with this public confrontation. "Stolen artifacts?" James's voice rose with indignant anger. "These people saved Billy's life last night with medicines that actually worked while Pike's conventional treatments were useless. If their bundle is stolen property, then I'm the King of France." The rancher's support carried enormous weight in a community where his word was law and his displeasure could be fatal. But more important was the precedent it represented: a prominent citizen publicly acknowledging the value of native medicine and the competence of unconventional healers. "The federal government has jurisdiction over all tribal ceremonial objects," Agent Cross interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "The federal government can kiss my ass," James Morrison replied bluntly. "These people are healers, not thieves. Anyone with eyes can see they're using that bundle for exactly what it was meant for: saving lives and helping sick people." The confrontation was rapidly spiraling beyond Captain Morrison's control. Public support for the healers, combined with legal evidence of legitimate ownership, made seizure of the bundle politically dangerous as well as legally questionable. But Morrison was also a man who'd built his reputation on completing assigned missions, regardless of obstacles or opposition. Failure to secure the bundle would be seen as weakness by superiors who valued results over methods. That made him more dangerous, not less a cornered predator with nothing left to lose. "This investigation will continue," Morrison said, finally signaling his men to maintain their positions around the clinic. "Until ownership questions are resolved through proper legal channels, this settlement remains under federal supervision." It was as close to retreat as Morrison could manage while maintaining face, but it also meant the crisis was far from over. His forces would remain in Bitter Creek, looking for any excuse to complete their original mission through alternative means. As the immediate confrontation diffused into uneasy standoff, Giselle found herself standing beside her newly discovered grandfather, both of them grappling with emotional revelations while surrounded by armed men whose intentions remained unclear. "We need to talk," Pike said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "About your parents, about the bundle, and about why I've been drinking myself to death for 20 years instead of trying to find you." "After we deal with this," Giselle replied, nodding toward Morrison's men who were setting up what looked like a permanent encampment around the clinic. "They're not going to give up easily." Chaska approached them with grim determination written across his features. "Morrison's planning something more than legal seizure," he said quietly. "Men like him don't accept defeat gracefully. When legal methods fail, they usually turn to other options." The warning proved prophetic. That evening, as Bitter Creek settled into uneasy sleep under federal surveillance, Morrison's real plan began to unfold. The captain hadn't come just to confiscate a sacred bundle, he'd come to eliminate a troublesome native leader whose survival threatened broader government policies in the region. The attack came at midnight, swift and brutal as a winter storm. Morrison's men surrounded Giselle's cabin while she and Chaska were inside studying the bundle's contents by lamplight, preparing for the teaching sessions they discussed. Pike had joined them, hoping to learn more about his granddaughter's work and perhaps find redemption through useful contribution to her healing practice. The first warning came from Chaska's warrior instincts, a subtle wrongness in the night sounds that made him reach for his weapons even before conscious thought identified the danger. "Company," he said quietly, blowing out the lamp and moving toward the window with fluid grace. At least a dozen men surrounding the building. Pike fumbled for his old army revolver, while Giselle gathered her medical supplies with automatic efficiency. If they were going to fight their way out, someone would certainly be wounded, and her healing skills might be the difference between survival and death. "This is Captain Morrison," came a voice from outside. "You're surrounded and under arrest for possession of stolen held in custody by the Office of Indian Affairs or Army stores as evidence or ethnographic property and conspiracy against territorial authority. Surrender now, and you won't be harmed." The promise was almost certainly false. Morrison had come too far and risked too much to settle for arrests and legal proceedings. This was an execution disguised as law enforcement, designed to eliminate problems that couldn't be solved through official channels. "What do you want us to do?" Pike whispered, his hands shaking with fear and whiskey withdrawal. "Survive," Chaska replied grimly. "Whatever it takes." The cabin's windows exploded inward as Morrison's men opened fire, filling the air with flying glass and splinters from wooden walls that provided little protection against rifle bullets. The three of them dropped to the floor and crawled toward better cover, but the small building offered few options for defense against determined attackers. "We need to get out of here," Giselle said urgently, noting how quickly the thin walls were being shot to pieces. "This place won't hold them off for more than a few minutes." But escaping the surrounded cabin would require crossing open ground under fire from superior numbers with limited weapons and no guarantee of safety, even if they reached other buildings. Morrison's men had positioned themselves to control all possible escape routes. The situation looked hopeless until Giselle remembered something from her medical training that might shift the odds in their favor. Among her supplies were chemicals used for cleaning surgical instruments and preserving specimens, substances that could be combined to create smoke confusion and temporary incapacitation for their attackers. "I can make something to help us," she said quickly, crawling toward her medical bag while bullets continued punching holes in the walls around them. "Chloroform and carbolic acid mixed with alcohol. It won't kill them, but it should create enough confusion for us to get away." For crowd blindness, they used carbolic-soaked rags and a pinch of pepper or stove ash with damp straw smoke to sting eyes. Chloroform, when needed, was applied only up close on a cloth. Working by feel in the darkness, she began combining chemicals in glass bottles, creating crude but effective smoke bombs that would fill the area around the cabin with choking, disorienting fumes. It wasn't sophisticated chemistry, but frontier medicine had taught her to improvise with whatever materials were available. "When I throw these outside, we go out the back window," she instructed. "Stay low, move fast, and head for the clinic. Pike, do you still have keys to the building?" "Yes, but what good will that do? They'll just follow us there." "The clinic has stone walls and better defensive positions," Chaska explained, understanding her tactical thinking. "Plus medical supplies we can use to treat wounds and create more chemical distractions." Giselle threw her improvised smoke bombs through the shattered front windows, immediately filling the area with thick, acrid fumes that sent Morrison's men into fits of coughing and temporary blindness. In the confusion, the three of them escaped through the back window and ran through the darkness toward Pike's clinic. But Morrison had anticipated their movement. As they reached the clinic's back door, rifle fire erupted from new positions, driving them to seek cover behind a wagon while bullets sparked off metal and splintered wood around them. "They're everywhere!" Pike gasped, his breath coming in short, frightened bursts. "Not everywhere." Chaska corrected his warrior's training, helping him analyze their attackers' positions. "Morrison doesn't have enough men to completely surround the whole town. There are gaps in their coverage if we're smart about exploiting them." But before they could plan their next move, help arrived from an unexpected source. Lights began appearing in windows throughout Bitter Creek as townspeople awakened to the sounds of gunfire and realized their community was under attack. Mary Tate was the first to emerge from her boarding house carrying a shotgun and demanding to know why federal agents were shooting up the town in the middle of the night. Lee Chen appeared with his own weapon, followed by several of the miners who'd been helped by Giselle's medical treatment. "What's going on here?" Mary called out in her authoritative schoolmarm voice. "Captain Morrison, why are your men firing weapons in a residential area?" Morrison found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His unofficial mission required secrecy and deniability, but the gunfight had awakened the entire town and drawn attention he couldn't afford. Local citizens were armed and angry, demanding explanations he couldn't provide without revealing the illegal nature of his orders. "Federal law enforcement operation," Morrison replied tersely. "Citizens should return to their homes for their own safety." "Law enforcement." James Morrison's voice carried across the darkness as the rancher approached with several of his hands behind him. "William, what kind of law enforcement involves shooting up the clinic where people bring their sick children?" The family confrontation added another layer of complexity to Morrison's problems. James had influence throughout the territory, and his public opposition would make any cover-up impossible. The captain's mission was rapidly becoming a public relations disaster that could destroy his career. But Morrison was also a man who'd survived years of irregular warfare by adapting quickly to changing circumstances. If he couldn't complete his mission through stealth and deception, he would finish it through overwhelming force and intimidation. "This settlement is harboring fugitives from federal justice," Morrison announced, his voice carrying to everyone present. "Anyone who interferes with official operations will be considered accessories to federal crimes." The threat was designed to disperse the crowd and restore his tactical advantage, but it backfired spectacularly. Instead of retreating, the townspeople grew more defiant, understanding that their community's independence was under attack by outside forces. "The only fugitives I see are the ones shooting at our doctor," Mary Tate replied sharply. "Giselle Renard has done more good for this town than any federal agent ever has." Other voices joined in support, creating a chorus of anger that reflected months of gratitude for medical care that had saved lives and eased suffering. Morrison's men found themselves facing not just 3 isolated fugitives, but an entire community that had united in defense of people they considered essential to their survival. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by Morrison's growing desperation and deteriorating judgment. Realizing that his mission was failing and his reputation was at stake, the captain made a decision that transformed the situation from law enforcement into open warfare. "Burn them out," Morrison ordered his men. "Set fire to the clinic and surrounding buildings. Force them into the open where we can finish this properly." The command was both tactically sound and morally outrageous. Fire would indeed force the defenders from cover, but it would also destroy the medical facility that served the entire region and potentially spread to consume the whole town. But before Morrison's men could begin their arson, Chaska made a decision that drew on everything he'd learned from years of warfare against superior forces. Instead of waiting passively for attack, he would take the initiative and carry the fight to his enemies. "Keep them busy," he told Giselle and Pike as he prepared to move. I'm going to circle around and try to capture Morrison. Without their leader, his men might surrender. It was a desperate plan that depended on stealth surprise and considerable luck, but it was better than waiting to be burned alive or shot down in the open. Chaska disappeared into the darkness, with the fluid grace of a natural predator, leaving his companions to maintain defensive fire and create distractions. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse through Bitter Creek's dark streets, with Chaska using every skill learned from years of guerrilla warfare to outmaneuver enemies who had superior numbers but inferior knowledge of the terrain. He moved like a ghost through shadows and alleys, picking off isolated sentries and creating confusion among Morrison's forces. Meanwhile, Giselle and Pike held their position at the clinic, using medical knowledge and surgical tools to create improvised weapons and defensive measures. She prepared more chemical compounds to incapacitate attackers, while Pike drew on old army experience to coordinate their defense with the townspeople who had taken up arms in support. The battle raged through the night with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Morrison's men had training and equipment, but the defenders had motivation and intimate knowledge of their community's layout. Every building, every alley, every possible hiding place was familiar territory that could be used for tactical advantage. But the turning point came when Chaska succeeded in his mission to capture Captain Morrison. Using warrior skills and intimate knowledge of stalking techniques, he managed to get close enough to the federal commander to take him prisoner without alerting his subordinates. "Call off your men," Chaska demanded quietly, his knife at Morrison's throat while they crouched behind a water trough near the town's main street. "Order them to withdraw, or you won't live to see sunrise." Morrison was a professional soldier who understood when he'd been outmaneuvered by a superior tactician. His mission had failed, his position was compromised, and continuing to fight would only result in unnecessary casualties on both sides. "Stand down," Morrison called out to his scattered forces. "Cease fire and withdraw to defensive positions. The operation is concluded." The order was met with confusion from his men, but military discipline held. Federal agents began pulling back from their attack positions, leaving the townspeople and defenders to emerge from cover and assess the damage. As dawn broke over Bitter Creek, the extent of the night's destruction became visible. Several buildings had been damaged by gunfire, windows were shattered throughout the town, and the clinic had taken considerable damage. But no one had been killed, and the medical facility remained functional despite the assault. Captain Morrison was turned over to territorial authorities for trial on charges ranging from assault to abuse of federal authority. His illegal mission and the violence it had generated became a scandal that reached all the way to Washington, ultimately leading to investigations and reforms in how the government dealt with Native American issues. But for Giselle, Chaska, and Pike, the most important outcome was personal rather than political. The crisis had forced them to work together, trust each other, and discover strengths they hadn't known they possessed. Their partnership had been tested under extreme circumstances and had emerged stronger than ever. In the weeks that followed, as Bitter Creek rebuilt from the damage and life returned to something approaching normal, the three of them found time to explore the family relationships and cultural connections that the night's events had revealed. Pike's revelation about being Giselle's grandfather opened doors to understanding her family history and medical heritage that had been closed for over 20 years. She learned about her birth parents, their work among different communities, and the respect they had earned from people across racial and cultural boundaries. "Your father was a remarkable man," Pike told her as they worked together to repair the clinic's damaged interior. Jean-Baptiste Dubois believed that healing was a universal language that could bring different peoples together. He proved it through his work during the smallpox epidemic, earning trust and friendship from Lakota healers who shared their knowledge with him. The story explained not just the bundle's legitimate ownership, but also why Giselle had felt such natural affinity for its contents. She'd inherited not just sacred objects, but also the medical philosophy and cultural understanding that came with them, a legacy from her birth father that connected her to healing traditions spanning multiple communities. Chaska's role in teaching her proper use of the bundle's medicines created opportunities for cultural exchange that went far beyond medical training. As he shared traditional knowledge about plants, prayers, and healing ceremonies, Giselle gained understanding of Lakota spiritual beliefs and their connection to practical medicine. Among my people, Chaska explained as they prepared remedies from the bundle's contents, healing is about more than treating symptoms. It's about restoring balance between the person, their community, and the spirit world. The medicines work better when they're used with proper understanding of these connections. Their teaching sessions became something more than professional training. They became opportunities for two people from different backgrounds to learn about each other's cultures, beliefs, and dreams for the future. As winter gave way to spring, their partnership deepened into mutual respect and growing affection that transcended racial boundaries. The romantic relationship that developed between them was built on shared experiences, common values, and genuine admiration for each other's skills and character. It wasn't the sudden passion of dime novels, but the steady growth of trust and companionship that could weather any storm. "I never thought I'd find someone who could see past the scars," Giselle confided one evening as they sat together on the clinic's front porch, watching the sun set over the Dakota prairie. "Most people look at me and see only the damage from the fire." "The scars are part of who you are," Chaska replied gently, reaching out to touch her scarred cheek with reverent fingers. "They tell the story of someone who survived tragedy and used that experience to help others heal. That's not damage, that's strength." Their wedding took place in June, with the ceremony conducted by both territorial judge and Lakota spiritual elder to honor both their backgrounds. The celebration was attended by most of Bitter Creek's population, along with representatives from tribal communities and territorial government who recognized the significance of their partnership. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Pike offered a toast to the newlyweds, his voice steady and strong as he spoke about family healing and the courage required to build bridges between different worlds. 24 years ago, I helped save a little girl from a terrible fire," he said, raising his glass to the assembled crowd. "Today, that little girl has become a woman who saves lives every day through skill, courage, and compassion that far exceed anything I could have taught her. She's found a partner who shares her dedication to healing and her belief that medicine belongs to all people, regardless of their background or beliefs." The toast was echoed by everyone present, creating unity that transcended the divisions separating different groups within the territory. Crises had tested everyone's courage and character, but they'd also revealed the strength that came from working together rather than remaining isolated in mutual suspicion. As their first year of marriage progressed, Giselle and Chaska established a medical practice that served both Native and white communities throughout the region. Their clinic became known as a place where anyone could receive treatment, regardless of their ability to pay, their race, or their cultural background. The success of their integrated approach to frontier medicine attracted attention from territorial authorities, medical schools, and tribal leaders who were interested in replicating their model elsewhere. But it also drew opposition from those who preferred traditional boundaries between communities and resented any challenge to established hierarchies. Deputy Murdoch, released from jail after serving 6 months for his role in Morrison's illegal operation, continued to make trouble whenever possible. He spread rumors about Indian magic and foreign witchcraft, trying to undermine confidence in the clinic's treatments and the competence of its practitioners. But his efforts were largely unsuccessful. Too many people had been helped by Giselle and Chaska's medical care to believe claims about dangerous or ineffective treatments. The evidence of healed bodies and saved lives was more convincing than prejudice and political rhetoric. The most significant challenge came not from local opposition, but from federal policies that continued to treat native healing knowledge as primitive superstition unworthy of respect or protection. Government agents periodically arrived to investigate reports of unauthorized medical practices, though they found no legal basis for interference with the clinic's legitimate operations. Through it all, the partnership between Giselle Chaska and Pike continued to grow stronger. They had created something unprecedented in Dakota territory, a medical practice that combined the best of different healing traditions while serving all members of their community regardless of background or beliefs. Pike's redemption was perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. Freed from the guilt and alcohol that had consumed him for decades, he became a skilled and dedicated physician whose knowledge complemented his granddaughter's skills perfectly. Their partnership proved that healing was indeed a family tradition that could span generations and transcend cultural boundaries. As their second year together began, they received word that Captain Morrison had been convicted of federal crimes and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Agent Cross had been dismissed from government service, and several other officials involved in the illegal operation faced criminal charges. Justice had been served, but more importantly, precedent had been established. The case demonstrated that federal authority had limits, that local communities could successfully resist government overreach, and that cooperation between different peoples was not only possible but beneficial for everyone involved. The sacred bundle remained at the heart of their work, but its significance had evolved beyond its original religious and cultural meanings. It had become a symbol of healing that transcended boundaries of knowledge that belonged to all peoples, and of the possibility that different traditions could work together for the common good. On a warm summer evening, as they prepared medicines for the next day's patients, Giselle and Chaska reflected on everything they had accomplished together. "Any regrets?" Chaska asked, taking her hand in the casual gesture that had become natural between them. "None," Giselle replied without hesitation. "Even the scars led to something beautiful. Even the pain taught us lessons we needed to learn." Their partnership had begun with a gunshot in a winter alley and a sacred bundle that belonged to people who understood healing as work that transcended cultural boundaries. It had survived assassination attempts, federal investigations, community prejudice, and every challenge that frontier life could generate. But more than survival, it had created transformation in themselves, in their community, and in broader understanding of how different peoples could live and work together for mutual benefit. Their clinic would continue serving the region for decades to come, training new healers and proving that cooperation was stronger than conflict. As stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had blessed their union and the healing work that grew from it, they walked hand in hand toward a future brighter than either had dared imagine during the dark days of crisis and danger. The scarred French healer and the Lakota warrior had found each other across cultural divides that seemed impossible to bridge, proving that some bonds were strong enough to transcend any barrier when forged in service to healing and hope. Their story would be remembered in Bitter Creek for generations to come, not just as romance, but as evidence that love properly understood was always about choosing to build something beautiful together, rather than remaining isolated in fear and suspicion. The epidemic was over, the corruption was ended, and the real work of building just and healthy communities could continue with confidence that it would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. In a small Dakota Territory town, 3 people had proven that healing, whether medical, social, or spiritual, was always possible when people chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice, and love over fear.